Hello students, welcome to podcast 2B, the Puritans of New England. This is Dr. P. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to identify which characteristics of Puritans' religious belief and culture, and of New England in general, helped them to achieve success during the early 17th century. You should take notes on this podcast and listen to it as many times as you need to in order to answer this learning objective, and feel free to pause the podcast as necessary. In the previous podcast, we learned a bit about the particular branches of Protestantism that made their way to New England, in particular the Pilgrims and Puritans, Separatists and Puritans. Before we go any further, let's take a look at the location of New England, which you can see here in the northeasternmost corner of the present-day United States. This region today comprises the states of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Connecticut, teeny Rhode Island, and Massachusetts. During the colonial period, the territory inside present-day Maine and Vermont, though, belonged to other colonies. The Puritans' religious beliefs profoundly influenced the social, political, and economic structures and practices of 17th century New England. In particular, while the Puritans believed in predestination, that God had determined at the start of time whose soul would be saved and whose would be damned, they also believed that consistent, hard work was an outward sign that one was in fact predestined for heaven. They also believed that spending money wastefully was a sign that one's soul was destined for hell. Therefore, these hard workers dedicated themselves to their work and often invested any profits back into their small businesses. While the religious motivation behind these practices waned by the 18th century, the habits of hard work and reinvestment of profits resulted in what the sociologist Max Weber has called the Protestant work ethic. This Protestant work ethic was an important factor behind the Puritans' establishment of a successful colony in New England during the 17th century. Equally important, back in England, Puritans came from middle-class backgrounds used to having to work hard to get ahead. Unlike the aristocratic migrants to the Chesapeake, the Puritans were not members of the landed gentry. Rather, most of them possessed skills that would be useful in starting a new colony. They fished cod, for example, or cut down timber that were used for shipbuilding and other industries. And artisans began small businesses needed for the functioning of a new colony. Soap and candle makers, shoemakers, tanners, and blacksmiths and the like were all among the middling sort who formed the core of colonial New England society. So, whereas the Chesapeake, which you'll learn about in a later podcast, wound up becoming a colony dedicated to the large-scale cultivation of just a single crop, tobacco, New England's Puritans' diverse skills, as well as their remarkable work ethic, played key roles in their ability to create a colonial economy that flourished. Likewise, New England itself offered a prime location for the hard-working Puritans' colonies. Long, cold winters and rocky soil made it difficult to establish large-scale plantation agriculture, as did their fellow Englishmen further south in the Chesapeake. Nevertheless, their short summers also meant that disease did not proliferate as quickly or as widely as it would in Virginia, where the mortality rate was quite high up until 1675. Therefore, more Puritans survived the first difficult years of colonization than did their Anglican neighbors to the south. And while I'm talking in the rest of this paragraph here, I'd like you to just look at and examine this map that shows the remarkable spread of the Massachusetts Bay Colony westward in just a very short period of time, in just about 70 years. While today the word Puritan connotes a prudish attitude towards sex, clearly the 17th century Puritans enjoyed robust relations in that regard. They had migrated to America as families and valued a strong family unit with the father as the head of the family, as they viewed God the head of his family of believers. The cold, healthful climate allowed their large families to survive and proliferate beyond Massachusetts Bay, south and west into the Connecticut River Valley, and north into what is today New Hampshire and Vermont. This rapid spread brought them into quick conflict with the existing residents of these areas, the Native Americans. In future podcasts, we'll explore these conflicts. But in spite of these conflicts, as you can see here in this map, Puritans were able to experience demographic success in 17th century New England thanks to the region's climate and their own tight-knit family unit and social structures and work ethic. In conclusion, it was a rich combination of religious, social, economic, and geographic factors that went into making 17th century New England a stable and prosperous colony. The combination of who the Puritans were, hard-working, tight-knit families, highly ordered social structure, intolerant of dissent, and what New England offered, a cold climate which prevented the spread of disease and a variety of natural resources from which they could make their living, enabled the Puritans to create a colony that was socioeconomically successful during the 17th century. Take a moment to review the learning objective and write out your answer in a short paragraph now. If you cannot do so, go back and watch the podcast again, stopping it as many times as you need to take notes until you can answer this objective in writing. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next podcast.